Hi there, I'm Jenny Knight from the self-directedlearner.org, and I'm absolutely delighted today to be joined by an extraordinary person and educator, Dr. Laura Yee. Laura, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
And Laura, this is probably one of the most sensitive topics for me personally. And I think it's because I'm not always sure about the appropriate language and sensitivity around equity.
Mm.
Do you have a response to that?
I do. I think that so much of diversity work, which I think it's been called for many years, has been done in either one of two ways, right? So one is, I think, the call out. So someone makes a mistake, uses the wrong terminology, and they're called out for it, and the results can be very shameful, right? Or blaming. So it can be shaming and blaming approach. The other approach is to really call in people, and that approach involves naming what was said or what was done and doing it in a way that invites people into the conversation. And so I really think there's two camps of folks who go about diversity and equity work in one of these two ways. Certainly, there are some people who use a bit of both, but really, from my perspective, those are two major approaches to doing this work. And um, they're both effective in different ways. I think that I'm a subscriber of the latter because I truly believe that you can say anything in the moment, you can look like you're listening in the moment, you can have that conversation in the moment, being shamed or blamed. But when a teacher closes the door, what happens behind the door is really up to them. And so for me, the goal is to really guide someone, call someone in, and invite them into the conversation so that they can really change their mindsets or consider different frames or consider changing their mindset or just see something differently, or and that's the really the only way that we're going to make more equitable schools, because the number of decisions teachers make on a daily basis is infinite, right? And every decision counts. You could be deciding to stand in the front of the room, you could decide to walk this way toward this student, that way toward another student. Everything matters in that classroom, in both visible and invisible ways. And it's all, part of what my research investigated was the connection between someone's lived experience and identities, their habits of mind, how they think, and ultimately the decisions they make. And there's a huge connection between those two, as you can imagine. So if we're not inviting or calling in people to those conversations, then they can say whatever they want. But if we're not shifting mindsets, then ultimately none of those behaviors will change. And if those behaviors don't change, then we are likely perpetuating inequities in our classroom. So if you're feeling hesitant to use language or to share an idea because of fear, shame, or blame, that tells me that you've engaged in some kind of conversation or had an experience where people have really been calling out instead of calling in. And I think a lot of that is happening in a lot of places right now. I do believe there's a moment for the calling out. Especially if a lot of calling in has not been working. But for me, it's not the first place to go, especially with teachers and educators in general.
Mm, what a profound insight. So, what does the word equity mean to you?
I think of equity as the big umbrella, that equity involves diversity, it involves inclusion. It means that everybody gets what they want, right? Not necessarily the same. There's that classic image of the children with the outside the fence, right? Um, and it really means for me, from an education perspective, that everybody has not only equal opportunity and access to succeed, but they also have the equitable supports that they need. Um, and the two really, they're not the same. There's a lot of policies that say, some students, all students can only have this level of support, or all students can only access this curriculum, or this group of students can access this other set of curricula. And it's not taking into account all the discrepancies that students walk into the classroom with, and teachers as well, right? There's everything that happened with every single individual prior to walking in that classroom has an effect on how they think,
Mm.
and how they make decisions, how they engage. I was not raised to make eye contact in conversation. In fact, it was something that was very much discouraged. But in US culture, right, when you're listening to someone, one of the nonverbal cues to tell the person that I'm listening is to give eye contact. And so that's something that I've had to, and I continue to work on, to be honest. And it's little things like that that can really make any individual student's experience different from another, or any teacher's experience different from another. And we have to take those things into account when we're looking at how students learn and how we're assessing students. We need to make sure that the ways that we're assessing students are valid and reliable, not only from a testing perspective, but that really from a systemic perspective, taking into account everything that could have gone into that child's former experience with school and schooling, and just in life. That's why it's so important to have a diverse staff, right? Because
Oh my
everyone
gosh.
walks in with different lived experiences, and everyone is natural. Like, everyone has biases. It's not something to be ashamed of, right?
Mhm.
And if we are truly committed to providing equitable spaces for all our students and teachers, then we have to be committed to examining those biases, and really being conscious of them. So for me, equity is all about truly considering all aspects of a student's or an individual's identity, and the lived experiences that they bring to a space, and then using that as a resource to tap for learning. I
Mm.
mean, we say a lot in education, right? Like, meet the student where they are, know your students. And that, I think, has been taken to heart in a lot of ways with best intentions by teachers and administrators and policymakers. And though I think what's been missing is really taking into account understanding how social identifiers really contribute to making that student who they are. So, I can know my students' interests and their strengths and their growing edges, and how they engage with other students and adults, and any number of things. And if I'm not also considering what their lived experience has been, and how their multiple identities have impacted or engaged with the environment around them, and what the impact has been, then we don't really know our students. And that's something that I think has been an elephant in the room in a lot of schools. People have been afraid to talk about race and talk about age and talk about any number of identifiers. And we really aren't doing our students justice if we're leaving that out, because that's fundamental to who they are and how they engage with others. So, yeah, I
Wow.
don't know if
So,
that's
so
that
let's
answers your
let's
question.
try and unpack all of that. Because you've mentioned, as you said, three huge aspects of each child that we don't talk about in schools. In fact, I'm just sitting here right now and thinking about the idea of social identifiers, that I can assume I know what a child's social identifiers might be, but I think I have to go into their home. I think I have to have conversations with their family, whoever they live
Hmm.
with. I think I need to see them. I need to see them certainly outside of school.
Yes.
And depending on the age of the child, I need to ask them directly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Would that be, what else could I do as an educator to really appreciate and know, be able to identify a child's social identifiers?
Well, I think different, right? Different individuals come into their own levels of racial literacy, I guess, at different ages. And it really depends. This is where the parent partnership is so important to me, because different families, different parents have very, very different feelings about whether or not they want to talk about race and other things. Um, some are very, very strongly of the camp that, I am raising, like in my case, I am raising a half Chinese child. And that is very important to me. And it's very important that my child knows that and has embraced that, and sees himself or themselves, I guess, in more places than in society at large, because they're not seen much at all. So in a conversation with their teacher, right, I might say, this is really important to me, as much as you can bring in voices or experiences or positive narratives about people of Chinese descent, like that would just be appreciated on my part. And my child knows that he's half Chinese, and um, as much as you can build him up and affirm him in that way, that would be great. Other people would say that's not important to me, right? Um, and though we also know that we don't even need to necessarily talk to children, right? We do talk about skin color in the earliest grades at GDS. So students are 4 or 5 years old when we're talking about skin color. And that is a major part of everyone's identity, because no matter how you feel, you are seen by others a certain way. And because of our history, how they're perceived has a huge impact on how people interact with them. So to have conversations about skin color and talk about the biology behind it and give them the terminology of melanin, and have an understanding of why people's skin color look different, that's very empowering. And then second to that, you need to affirm those skin colors, right? Because so much of what our students are seeing is predominantly white, predominantly kind of middle class cultural norms, um, and that's just not all of our students' realities. So being able to counter those messages that are pervasive in the world can be very powerful for students. So our teachers do amazing affirming activities and learning experiences with students, where, even visually in the classroom, they have different dolls with different skin colors, different types of hair. Um, they try to include as many positive stories from different religious traditions or from different cultures as possible. And that exposure, I think, can speak volumes for a student. They may not know it, but it is having an impact. And then doing more explicit things, like everyone writes a poem about their skin, and they use simile and they talk about imagery. And so they come up with these beautiful poems where they compare their skin colors to chocolate or honey, or these beautiful images or delicious foods or anything positive, so that they can start to have that positive identity about their skin color without even talking about race, right? Because the social construction of race is something they do learn about later. Um, but something as simple as skin color and affirming that, trying to counter the messages that they're getting outside of our schools, is something we actually can control. We cannot control what happens out there. I cannot control that whenever my children, my personal children, turn on, TV or watch a movie, it's predominantly people who don't look like them. I can't control that, right? But in my classroom, I can. That's something I can do very intentionally. And that's what it's all about. It's about really being intentional about the decisions you're making in your classroom and being increasingly aware of them. So I think knowing the social identifiers is the first step, and then understanding stories of people who've lived, who identify in those ways. And that can include even, expanding your own social group, reading, right? Just knowing the diverse experiences of people who have multiple identities that may not be from the dominant group, is crucial, because that's the only way that we're really going to have a better understanding of the other. And that's the only way that we can really try to empathize and understand our students in a way that they need us to understand them.
Mm. Yeah,
So yeah, knowing your
that's
students
very,
is huge. Truly knowing your students.
yeah, so very, very true. So let's go to the very big and challenging topic of hiring a faculty that reflects, if not your student population, although you hope it would be reflective of your student population. Certainly in gender, there's one area that needs to really expand, given that education tends to attract female whites. Um,
Mhm.
what and obviously if it's a school in a really racially diverse area, what suggestions do you have for a school to attract, or maybe just even education in general? How can we become a more attractive profession to diverse groups of people?
Wow, that's a huge question. If I had all the right answers, I'd be a billionaire. So I will do my best. But I think about, and I think you and I are aligned in this, that we think about teachers' growth trajectory as being everlasting, right? So you become an educator and you never cease to learn, and you never cease to grow. And so for me, the hiring is the beginning, right? Recruitment, and then hiring, and then how do we support students in their continued teachers, excuse me, in their continued growth once they're one of ours, is the kind of second part. But in terms of recruitment and hiring, there are fewer people of color who are educators in the profession. That has a lot to do with many, many, many things. It's not for lack of talent or interest or intellect, right? There's just a lot of systemic barriers that many people of color experience in terms of accessing quality education or experiences to become a high quality teacher. But I think recruitment is huge. You have to post in a way for your jobs that doesn't necessarily have qualifications that may exclude certain populations, right? I mean, what are you really looking for? Are you looking for a teacher who has more than 5 years of experience? Or are you looking for a teacher who has a certain set of skills and a certain way of teaching, right? I would argue that it's the latter. It doesn't matter how many years of experience necessarily that person has. You can have people with 20 years of experience, and still their approach to teaching is not aligned with your mission. So it's little things like that. I've started to take out kind of the degree qualifications and all those things that really present as barriers to particularly female identifying individuals and people of color, BIPOC. Just we know that we don't tend to apply to positions that we don't think we're qualified for. And we do know that cisgender men, white identifying, more often apply to positions for which they are not qualified. And they have a better chance of getting those positions, right? So,
Yeah.
how can we, on the recruitment side, beginning with that job post, um, make an inspiring opportunity for people and try to consider, really what are we looking for? Having those conversations with key stakeholders and key decision makers. Like, what are we looking for in this person when they join our community? Right? It's not necessarily a degree, it's their skills, it's their mindsets, it's their kind of how they engage with others, right? And really pinpointing those on the back end so that you all know that you're in the same page, and looking for certain things, not a certain type of person who's had access to a number of different experiences that other people haven't and still may not have the mission aligned skills. So recruitment, I think, is huge. And then there's a number of organizations and um, HBCUs that I think go undertapped in terms of recruitment. And how can we really reach out? I mean, there are a number of community colleges that have excellent teacher preparation programs. And they're not those big names that everyone goes, woo, when they see it on a resume, right? We know, I'm sure you've experienced, as I have, that resume only does so much. It gets you in the door if you're looking at certain things. But really for me, it's more the interview and the lesson demo that can speak hugely to whether or not someone should be joining our community, someone that we want to join our community. But you need to expand that pool to begin with in terms of recruiting, right? You want the most robust, the most diverse pool of candidates, so you can ultimately always hire the best fit person, but you have a greater chance of hiring someone who may be from a non-dominant group if on the recruitment end, right, you're taking away a lot of those barriers that typically discourage people from applying. So those two aspects are huge for me, is being really clear on the skills and capacities and mindsets that you're looking for in a candidate, and then doing your posting in a way that is very intentional. Again, that intentionality is key for me. Being very intentional about, okay, is that really something that we need this person to come to our community with? Or is it just one of those things that we're legitimating, right, in this cycle of oppression? Is it just another way that we're legitimating and validating the kind of myth of meritocracy, in terms of, going to such and such school versus another school? And then for me, once you have a new colleague in your community, then really making sure you have the supports in place.
Yes.
If it is if it's someone who identifies as BIPOC or from any non-dominant group, do they have a safe space, at least one, where they can truly be themselves? Because we know you can't completely be yourself in a predominantly white space. It's not possible for many people who identify from a number of different groups, but we know how to play the game. It's all about playing the game, right? We know there's a game that needs to be played.
Right.
And if I don't know, then I sure hope that there are systems in place at the school to teach me so I can be successful, right? A lot of educators of color, may not have been in an independent school previously, or they are new to independent schools. There's a fantastic population of exceptional teachers in public schools. And we try to draw from that pool when we can. And though, if they didn't attend an independent school, they don't have any familiarity with an independent school, they really need help understanding what the kind of invisible norms are and what the language expectations are. And it's really important to provide that level of support and to do it in a way that doesn't in any way undervalue what they already bring to the school, right? That this is just another game to play. And it doesn't mean that your way of thinking or doing is any less valuable. And though, if you are going to join this community, this is the game that we need to play to be successful. And honestly, that's something I try to teach my children, because
Mm.
it is a game. It is a game. And if we teach it as the only way to be, then that's a very likely way to erase what students from different backgrounds bring to our communities, right? It is not the only way. It is the most valued way right now in our society. So do students need to write? Yes, they need to know how to write. They need to know how to write a particular way, because that's what will get them far in the world out there. But it doesn't mean that how they talk or how they think or how they write is bad or is wrong, right? And there's a distinction between those two approaches that I
Mm.
think is very, very important, right? Yeah, so that's what I try to teach my personal children and my
Yeah.
students as well, right? The way that you think and the way that you do things, that's something that we need to value and affirm in some way. And there's this other skill set that you just need to be successful out there. And that's my responsibility, is to give you those skills and to prepare you for out there, while also making sure you come out of this educational journey whole and not broken.
Mm.
That's really hard.
Yeah,
It's
no,
really hard to
that's,
do.
I mean, obviously there are so many children. It was never part of my experience to imagine I would come out less than whole and certainly not
Mhm,
broken.
mhm.
And yet
Right.
that just isn't the reality for some children.
Mhm,
Yeah.
mhm,
Laura, when I first participated in one of your workshops, there were some activities that you did with us
mhm, mhm,
that I've never forgotten. And one of those was a grid activity where you gave us a grid. And can you just sort of walk us through just a quick summary of how the activity works? And then I've got some, I'll certainly share my insight, like my huge
mhm.
epiphany I got out of it, but just walk us through how that activity, how you set that activity up and why.
Sure. So, I guess a side note would be that if anyone is really interested in doing diversity work in a way that is meaningful and long lasting, don't hire the outside consultant to do a talk at your school or to do two workshops at your school. You have to own it and live it in your community.
Mm.
And one of the great diversity, equity, and inclusion researchers in education is Gary Howard. He's been around and done amazing work for decades. But that activity is from his curriculum called "We Can't Lead Where We Won't Go," and he developed this curriculum in order to basically hand it to schools and say, "Listen, if you want to do this." Um, find those people who are most enthusiastic about it and give them this, because it's like a training for the trainers, and really sets up a whole experience. Basically, it's a course for teachers to really dig into equity work in meaningful ways. That's not just the one and done, but can really change mindsets. And so that activity is, I think, one of many that are from that curriculum. So I have to give him credit. It's not me. I just use it a lot because it's so powerful. So as you recall, there is kind of a grid that everyone draws on paper. Um, and in each grid, you have to kind of write how you identify by some social identifier. So there is one called race, ethnicity. And if you remember, we talked about how they're not the same thing, but for the purposes of this exercise, we're going to put it in this one box. And so each individual writes how they identify and that way in that box. And then we'll go through a gender box. And so different identifiers. So by the end of kind of preparing for the activity, you have this grid of, I believe it's 6 social identifiers, and how each individual identifies by those social identifiers, by those categories. And then we go through this exercise where the scenario is that you're in a police state
Mm.
and you are under surveillance, and who you are makes you at risk, puts you at risk, personally at risk, and you fear that you might have to go underground because of how you identify, right? um, and you have to give up one of your identities in order to survive. So um, I might have to say, okay, well, I can, somehow not appear female, right? And so I could kind of give up the female identifier and somehow try to pass as male identifying, right? And you have to pick 2 that first round. So you end up crossing off 2 identifiers, and the ones that remain are ones that either you feel very strongly about and just can't live without, or that honestly you can't end up giving up because of the nature of what it is, right? And then we go to the second round, and the police state intensifies. And now you're not only fearful of your own safety, for your own safety, but the safety of those who you love. And you have to give up two more identifiers. So oftentimes the first round, right, people will cross off religion because it's easy to pass as someone who doesn't follow a particular faith tradition. And you can easily give that up compared to some other things. But after that second round, there are choices that people make that I think speak to their privilege, right?
Mm.
I can never cross off Chinese um, unless I find a great plastic surgeon, which probably wouldn't be available to me in a police state. I can't cross that off. I just can't. But someone who may be more racially ambiguous or have, different type of facial features or skin tone, they could possibly pass as a number of different things, right? So they could maybe cross that off. Whereas for me, that wouldn't be an option. Um, so you end up just seeing a number of things. I'm so curious to hear how you experienced it. But we do debrief it at the end, and depending on, right, the culture of the room and the climate of the room that you've created before, doing that activity, which hopefully is a safe one, then people can really honestly and vulnerably share how they engaged in that, how they experienced that activity, and why they made the decisions that they made. And I believe we did kind of pair shares between the two rounds. So you were sharing just with one other person to begin with, but at the end we did open it up for a whole group for discussion. So yeah, I love that activity. I think it's brilliant. And I'm so curious to hear how you experienced it, because you did it more than once, right?
I
I think we did
did,
it a
but
couple times.
it had a deeply profound effect because I realized that my identifiers were completely different to others, but it wasn't so much about me. It, it heightened for me that for some people, it daily life is almost a police state
Mm-hmm.
environment. And I had never really thought about that. Being a white female having an Australian accent
Mm-hmm.
has been, I have not experienced those kinds of things. The closest I ever experienced to being kind of labeled was re-entering the United States with a very old resident alien resident card alien
Mm-hmm.
resident card
Mm-hmm.
and having the immigration officer hold it up to my face and just say, why aren't you a US citizen? Like,
Wow.
so confrontational. And so one of the things on my card that I would not let go of was my dual citizenship. The
Mm-hmm.
fact that I had two passports. So it was a
Yes.
police state, but if this state was not conducive to me or my family thriving, then I would go to my other country.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But no, it's shocking, and yeah, it caused me to profoundly think that if I was a Black mother raising Black sons, I would have very different thoughts about raising them, I believe, raising my white sons.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think
Absolutely.
it's so very important. I'm curious though that you talked about in the beginning about the two kind of the call in and the call out
Mm-hmm.
around diversity work. But do both do you often find that even the call in um, happens in communities where there's a rising level of like something has possibly happened,
Mm.
and there's a rising level of concern? Or do
The
you?
call in approach.
Yes.
I don't think it necessarily matters the context. I think it matters who the people are. There are just people who go about it one way or another. And they have very different effects, right?
Yes.
And people respond differently to the different approaches. Some people, the call in will just never get them there. And sometimes you need to get called out, and maybe that gets them there, or maybe it doesn't.
Mhm.
Um, but, you know, one of the reasons why I'm such a huge fan of the calling in is, you know, as you know, I did a lot of work with understanding by design, with Jay McTighe and Grant Wiggins. And one of the things that they used to always say, or still say, or Jay does, is that you can't teach an understanding, right? It has to be uncovered. You
Right.
can't teach it. And that goes for curriculum design and for teaching, as well as changing habits of mind and ways of thinking. So for me, the call out can bring a level of awareness immediately, or a level of consideration in the moment, or even that can even be long lasting. And though for me, the goal is to not only have that level of awareness, but to have that consciousness impact how you move about the world, particularly in your classroom and school. So in order to do that, you have to have a deeper understanding of how you are perceived, or how, you know, your way of thinking may be legitimating, excuse me, certain ways of thinking that are harmful to our kids. So for me, the calling in is where I try to go, because my goal is really to change a person's way of thinking. And they cannot do that unless they truly understand how a child may navigate the world. And so that activity is one way that I think people do gain another level of understanding about that, right? Because every day, um, certain people, their identities are a threat to their existence. And that's just the truth of it. And you're right, there are many children who enter our schools, and teachers and parents and administrators, right, who it's not a game. It's not a simulation. Every day is a threat to them. And they have to either pass, or they have to hide certain parts of themselves, and learn how to navigate and play the game.
Mm. Laura, could you describe a classroom environment that you would see as being optimal in terms of equity?
Mm. Well, there isn't a truly equitable classroom. This just not possible. And we can always aim for it. So, in my opinion, an equitable classroom would have kind of the, I would say, more commonly known accommodations, or I would say tweaks, or hacks in how a teacher teaches, that really meets the needs of every student, and that the teacher is affirming every child's multiple identities, that they have positive experiences, positive relationships with the student and their families, that that teacher really is trying to understand what each student's lived experience is.
Mm.
Um, and that that teacher is constantly thinking about every decision they make, and how it may differentially impact each individual in that classroom. And it doesn't mean they will necessarily make a different decision, but they will make an informed decision, having that level of consciousness around the possible impacts, and therefore can, you know, adjust supports based on their acknowledgement of what those impacts may be. It's also really important that we think of what students bring to our classrooms as assets and as resources to teaching, right? It's not that they don't know anything. They actually, every student knows a lot, right? It may not be aligned with what our society has decided is really important to know and be able to do. And though there's so much value to understanding what they do know and how they do think, in order to tap that way of thinking and how they understand the world and how they problem solve, to then connect them to what we are responsible for teaching. So, and then finally, that teacher is just always trying to learn and always
Mm,
reflecting on the decisions that they made. No one is an expert. Everyone is learning, and um, that part is very important. I have so much to learn still. I make mistakes. I try to be as conscious as possible in terms of how I interact with people, and the decisions I make, the policies that we discuss and eventually decide upon. And though I have biases too, that's just how it is. I'm human. Which is why I'm so grateful at my school. Our administrative team is very, very diverse, not only racially, but in a number of different ways. And it's harder, I think, to function because you have multiple different perspectives. And it's so important. It's critical. It's
mm,
critical to being more intentional about the decisions that we do make. And again, it may not mean that we make different decisions, but we can prepare for the impact in a different way, knowing how the impact of that decision may land on different people in our community.
yeah. Well, what a beautiful way to end, Laura, because you've inspired us and given us direction of what we can all work towards. And it is continuous work, but the reality is I honestly can't think of more important work than the work of equity and making sure
Agreed.
that every child is fully recognized. No child is invisible. So thank
That's
you
right.
so very much.
Thank you for having me. It's so fun to actually talk to you so explicitly and in such great detail about all of this.
Let me
It's
just
so
end my,
important.
I have to see to end my recording.
Don't ask me.
I've got to edit anyway, so this is good. Stop recording. There, you'll receive an email notification. Okay, that's perfect. So aren't you using Zoom at your school?
We are. We've become very facile with the Zoom
Yeah,
technology.
no, it's really interesting to me to see what every school is doing.
Mm-hmm.
And probably more concerning to me, the more schools I'm hearing talk about can't wait to go back to what we had.
We can't. There's no way. There's no way we can. We just know more. We can do more now, right? We can't go back. There's no way. We can't unknow what we know now.
So is your school having that conversation?
Very much so. Very much so. What
That,
can we learn from the past, 13 months? What do we want to keep? What do we never want to go back to?
that is fantastic.
um, it's yeah, and we just have to. We can't. There's no way. I mean, teachers have learned so much, and they become great educators through an entirely different medium. It's amazing, and so it really like we can consider things that we didn't consider before.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, but inviting them into that conversation is huge as well.
Yes,
So
yes.
yeah,
And
yeah,
then
it is.
going to the children and having that conversation, and more importantly, going to well, not more importantly, and of equal importance is going to the parents.
Mm-hmm.
I had lunch yesterday with a friend of mine who he's one of those people after 2.5 hours, I'm just so buzzed with positivity and
Mm-hmm.
he's got that kind of energy about him. And you know, we were talking, he was in his business. I said, so what are you seeing as changing? And he said, he does analytics on retail.
Mm,
And he said, people are looking for experiences. Any service or product that they can buy online, they will, which means that when they show up somewhere, they want an experience. And he's actually created a model. And
mm,
I've the last 20, well, not 24 hours yet, but last 12 hours, I just can't get this model out of my head
mm,
because it's all the core of his model is the value added. And
mm-hmm,
I
mm-hmm.
think that, you know what, all schools, we have to have these conversations.
Yes,
So no,
yes.
I'm going to check back with you because I'm really curious to see what things you let go of and the things that you're really going to emphasize.
We'll see. It's hard to do, time is always our most precious resource. And we're also adjusting. I told you yesterday or whenever we spoke that we're bringing more students, we're changing our schedule once again. And so having those conversations on top of just the logistics of shepherding folks through this change in
Yes.
schedule without having too negative of an experience, it's just so much. It's so much.
Yeah.
It's so much, but it's absolutely important. We can't just go back. There's no way, right?
No.
You
Well, and quite
can't unknow
honestly,
what we know.
it's all part of equity.
Mm-hmm,
You
mm-hmm,
know,
mm-hmm.
that I was so, when I got off the phone to you the other day, I was just so tickled because you said you've not lost any faculty, like you've given
Mm-hmm.
faculty choice. And I've just been so devastated by schools that have, like even Miami Country Day School. Miami
Mm-hmm,
Country
mm-hmm,
Day School did not give faculty a choice.
mm-hmm.
And I know one middle school teacher who had a doctor's note. Her doctor advised her not to go back, and they said then you've got to resign. Whereas,
Wow.
yeah, which I mean, talk about. I thought that was against the law, but I guess in this, like what was legal in this moment of notice, right? Whereas
Mm-hmm,
John's
mm-hmm.
school has been incredibly um, supportive, and where they found all of these subs, but as John said, there are so many people who are unemployed because his school has to pay for a person to be in the classroom while he's been working at home. So he's been working
Oh,
at home.
wow.
Yeah. And yeah,
Mm-hmm,
and
mm-hmm.
the only thing that his school has done is reduced his salary by 10%,
Wow.
which still doesn't even cover the cost of the sub.
Mm-hmm,
But is that
mm-hmm.
not, I mean, it is an Episcopal school, and I do find that Episcopal schools tend to be, I mean, it's a very caring, super caring community.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And, but there are some days where, because, John sees the faculty that are out, there'll be like 20 faculty out because all the
Mm-hmm.
contact tracing they do. So how schools are managing all of that is just
It's
like,
so much.
yeah,
It's
it's,
so much.
it's huge. So,
I think part of why most faculty felt a little more comfortable returning to campus was we put a lot of mitigants in place, but it was hugely, it's hugely um, draining on our financial resources. And
of
we were
course.
testing everybody every week. So all students, all staff every week, PCR, not rapid. We have ventilators in every single classroom, every single space in the school, I would say. HEPA filters and all different sorts of things in those ventilators. And then, the most effective, of course, is the masking and distancing. So we have that in place too, but just so many things in place
Yeah.
um, that we were able to speak to for teachers. And we also got them, if people wanted face shields, they could have face shields. If they wanted, desk shields, they could get desks. So like whatever, again, equity, right?
Yeah.
Whatever a teacher wanted, basically, that
Yep.
would help them feel more comfortable coming back, we were able to
Yep.
provide. But we're in a position where our enrollment and applications were up. They're the highest that we've ever had in history. And so we are very fortunate to be in a pretty solid space
Yeah.
financially.
Yep.
And so we are able to provide, but most schools aren't in that place.
No,
Like they
not at
just
all.
can't afford it.
Yeah.
So we've been very, very fortunate. I'm very grateful. So
No,
grateful.
that's wonderful.
Yeah,
Wonderful,
yeah.
wonderful. Well, I have to say, I think that your absolute commitment and passion for the mission of your school is just going to play out really well for you.
I hope so.
Yeah. You know what? It just will. I'm just very optimistic about that. I
Mhm,
really
mhm.
am. So yeah.
It's
And you're,
important. It's
yeah,
important.
it really is. So
Mhm.
are you packed up ready for your camping trip?
Not at all. I have my giant list
Um,
ready to go, but I'll
I'll
throw
let you,
everything together
yeah, let you go
tonight.
get started on it. Laura, this has been wonderful.
Thank
Simon's
you so
working
much.
all week off site, so I we typically don't communicate, but over the weekend I'll touch base with him and
Oh,
tell him.
please
And I
do.
know the first thing he's going to ask is send me the video. It'll be edited and then it'll go up on our website.
Mhm,
So
mhm.
yeah, this is
All
awesome. Thank you
right.
so much.
Thank you. Oh my
All right.
gosh, I miss working with you all. It
Oh, well,
was
you
so
know what?
much fun. So much
My
fun.
hope is that this is going to go somewhere,
We'll
and
see. We'll
yeah,
see.
and
I'm
we can.
happy to be involved
Yeah,
however you need me.
no, believe me, it'll happen. All
All
right, take
right. All
care.
right. Take
Thanks, Laura.
care. Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.